Hi everyone, thanks for joining in today. I'm happy to have Katherine Kovacic with us. So Katherine's an award-winning author of the Alex Clayton Art Mystery Series. Her true crime book, The Schoolgirl Strangler, was published in January 2021. It delves into the shocking story of a serial killer at large in 1930s Melbourne. Katherine also had the honour of novelising Every Cow production Ms. Fisher's modern murder mysteries, bringing the character of Peregrine Fisher from screen to page. Just Murdered, Peregrine's debut adventure, was released in August 21. And just want to mention, I've just been reading Miss Fisher's modern murder. If I can, oh, it's disappearing a little bit, but
Hang on,
you
hang
can
on.
see the.
There you go. There you go.
And yeah, and I enjoyed reading it. I hadn't seen the TV series at all, but yeah. So thanks so much for joining us. Just wondering if you want to tell us a little bit more about the Murder Mysteries books, and I'm really interested to know some more about the Schoolgirl Strangler.
Sure. So I guess we'll start with Peregrine Fisher. Where to begin? Peregrine, if you're a fan of Kerry Greenwood's Phryne Fisher books, Peregrine was created by Every Cloud, who produced the Phryne Fisher television series as well. And she is Phryne's niece. So when the new Ms. Fisher's modern series picks up, Phryne, her plane has gone down over Papua New Guinea, missing, presumed dead, but who knows, as is the way of these sorts of things. And so Peregrine effectively inherits her aunt's estate until such a time as perhaps her aunt reappears. And season 1 of this program aired just over a year ago. And season 2 just came out on Acorn TV this year, and it's going to be on free-to-air Channel 7 later this year, I believe. But Every Cloud had wanted to novelise Peregrine, and they approached me as potentially someone who could do that. And yeah, so we ended up doing it. So the first one, Just Murdered, is based on episode 1 of season 1, and it sets the scene, really. It brings Peregrine to Melbourne and into that world that was Phryne's.
So it's quite interesting having a TV series already and then writing the novel. That's a little bit different the way round, isn't it?
It was very much, it's particularly weird when you think that it was, the Kerry Greenwood book that became a TV series, that became a spin-off TV series that then became a book.
Yeah.
So yes, it was very strange. And this is, of course, set in the 1960s now, as opposed to the much earlier era for Phryne. So it was a completely new world, but referencing that old one. And it was a mixed bag in terms of writing, because I was very aware of that audience base that already existed for Kerry's books in that world, and what they like to read in Kerry's things, but I'm very conscious of bringing my own voice and writing to it. And also having those characters there for me already.
Yeah.
That was really interesting, because I thought, they're there, it's going to be easy. And I got it, and I was like, they're not my characters. What do I do with them? And I kind of had to sit with them in my head for a couple of days, and I guess kind of get to know them and get a feel for that world before I could actually really dive in and start writing for them.
And did you know about them before they approached you?
I'd seen the original series when that was on television, and so I'd sort of had a vague idea, but that had sort of been a year or so previously, and then I very deliberately didn't go back and watch it again, because I didn't want what I did to be coloured by the way they sort of, and they were great. They gave me very, very open page to work with, and said, any questions, come back and discuss the Fisher world. But otherwise, I basically sort of had, carte blanche to do what I wanted within the confines of the story. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you know, why did they choose you? Do you know?
Well, I believe that there were several people that they spoke to. I gave them a sample chapter, so I was given the story Bible, which basically outlined, that gave a character description for the main characters and how they related to each other, and the running script for that first episode, which was about 15 to 20 pages, which ultimately became the 70,000+ word book. and they said, can you write us a sample chapter? So that was to see if I could capture the voice they wanted and I guess the lightness that they wanted, because that is something that characterises both the Phryne and the Peregrine Fisher television shows, is that it's, you know, it's a little bit frivolous, but it's without sort of being cheesy, and, you know, there's always a little bit of a message underlying it, particularly the 1960s. There's that feminism and, you know, the changing world that's coming through there.
Yeah.
So it was kind of if I could capture that voice, I think that's what they were really looking for.
And if they signed you up to do a certain amount of books, or?
It's all still up in the air. So it's I think it's a wait and see what sort of reception this gets, and how it ties in with future series for them, because that's, you know, it's always to do with funding and things like that. So, you know, are they going ahead with the season 3? So we've all got our fingers crossed that it's all going to work out, but it's still up in the air.
Yeah. And the Schoolgirl Strangler, are you able to tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So that's a true crime book, and it was about a serial killer, essentially. So a series of 4 murders that took place in Melbourne between 1930 and 1936, and this guy was kind of like an invisible man. And I think part of that was that police during that period really hadn't really encountered serial killers, you know, that was outside the bounds of what they were used to investigating. And this guy sort of, you know, he fitted the mold of a serial killer as we would understand it today. So, you know, he chose his victims to the outside world seemingly at random, you know, whereas, you know, he sort of had an agenda. There didn't seem to be a real motive for what he was doing. And it's a cliche, but it's true. He seemed like a really normal guy. You know, everyone around him, he had a wife, he had a child, good job, you know. So he was really hard for the police to sort of home in on. And it was really just sort of luck in the end that they got to him. But what really interested me about the case was the victims, you know, these 4 young girls. And it was such a sensational case at the time, and it had just faded into obscurity. But I kind of had these girls' names and ages in my head for several years before I actually got the chance to write the book.
And how did you first find out about
I was actually doing research for my first crime fiction book, which was The Portrait of Molly Dean, and that's partly based on a true crime, an unsolved crime from Melbourne in the 1930s. And I was researching crime and policing, and particularly crimes against women in that period in Melbourne. And I came across a couple of these crimes which sort of bookended the murder that I was interested in. And you know, I could sort of see sort of like what was going on there, and it was I was really interesting at the time, but I was focused on the other book, so I sort of put it to one side. Oh yeah, someone will write a true crime book about that, and focus on the work that was in front of me. And it wasn't until a couple of years later, I think probably about 2.5, 3 years later, that I realised I was still thinking about those girls, and that was when I decided to really dive into the research and see if I could put the book together.
Yeah. And for your research, were you able to find stuff easily?
It was a bit of a mixed bag at first. The Public Records Office was brilliant, but sometimes when you first start off in there, you know, things get misfiled and things disappear, and the things that you think are going to be big, fat, juicy files turn out to be, you know, a manila folder with one single piece of paper in there. So you kind of have to not think too laterally and sort of go off in all sorts of different directions and see what you can find. And then, of course, I went to all sorts of other sources as well beyond public records. So, you know, the state libraries and records office in different states, and local historical societies and school historians and descendants of you know, family members and things like that. So it was a drawn out process, and it was a little bit like those sort of criminology boards where there's like red, you know, wool linking all the photographs in the background.
Yeah.
A little bit like that.
Yeah.
But it all came together. So.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm sure you must have found lots of interesting facts and that from it. But I'm just wondering, is there anything you can share that you found that like was really interesting that won't be a spoiler?
I think certainly finding some of the more personal aspects, so the responses of the girls' families and things like that.
Yeah.
And talking to the descendants, it was really interesting that some of them, there was one woman I spoke to who said, I didn't find out that my great aunt had been murdered until I was 68 years old.
Yeah,
you know,
that's what I'm wondering if it was something hidden and
big family secrets. So that was actually really nice and really really good for me too, because I was able to give information back to these families that had known very little about what had actually happened. So finding those kind of details, I think, was really good. And I think the other thing that was interesting was that after the book was published, I actually had some information come forward about people whose grandmother or great aunt had. These sounded quite. Some of the stories are very urban legendy, but there were a few that were really sort of spot on, that their relative had been approached by this man, and they were the savvy child who realised there was something wrong and you were able to get away. So I thought that was quite amazing, because of course one of the things about this guy was that he seemed very normal and personable, and he was able to persuade children to come away with him. So for those one or two people that knew that there was something wrong, I just think that's quite amazing.
Yeah. And what sort of response did you get from the families after you'd written the book?
The response has been really, really positive. Talking to them in the writing process, there was one family that was, understandably very, defensive at first. Why do you want to know, and what are you going to do with the information? But overwhelmingly positive, because most of them didn't have the detail, and they didn't have that, the surrounding story. So to be able to fill in some of those gaps for them, and even I've now spoken to some of the descendants of one of the men who was falsely accused of one of the crimes, and that they were delighted with the information, and fitting things into the family history, the broader picture of the family history. And one woman sort of said to me, now it all makes sense why Grandpa was so protective of us when we were children and wouldn't let us play outside the front yard, and would never ever let us out of his sight. And they'd never known as kids why he was so so overly protective.
And we've got quite a few people watching, which is great. So I've got some questions from people. Kelly said she loves the idea of writing a book after the series. Is it easier or harder to write this way than a traditional book?
Wow, I think, I hate to say it, I think it's a bit of both. So on the one hand, it was great because the characters were there and the bones of the story were there. But it was also difficult because the script that I was sort of given to work with was, a basic script, and ultimately differed quite a bit from when I went and looked at it on television. So a 15-page script that had to become a 70 to 80,000 word book. So that was a little bit daunting. But I did have a lot of free space to work in. I was able to take the story off where I wanted to. I think once I'd found my place with those characters and found how I could play with them and enjoy being in that world, it was great. I really enjoyed writing the characters, and so I've got my fingers crossed that I'm going to get to play around with them again.
Yeah. And could you tell us a little bit about how you became a writer? Is it something you always wanted to do?
Look, I started out my professional career as a veterinarian, actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
So the first thing that I actually wrote that got any widespread attention was called the Dietary Management of Gastrointestinal Disease in Dogs and Cats.
Oh, okay.
So it was really, really well received, but it had a very small audience. But I took time away from veterinary work to help out in the family business, which was something completely unrelated. And that was going to be 6 months, and it became 3 years. And during that time, I also studied art history and got some qualifications in that. And then because I'd sort of been juggling all those different schedules, when all that kind of came to an end, I had space in my day, and I'd always thought I'd like to do some writing. But, many people, sort of girls who went through school at the same time I did, science was the thing, and arts degrees don't lead you anywhere, as we're all told when we're going through school. So this was my chance to go back and do some of the writing that I'd wanted to do. And that first book that I wrote, which was The Portrait of Molly Dean, that story was, as I said, based on an unsolved murder. And that the story interested me because it related to art history, and that was the thing that I'd been studying post veterinary science. And so I was actually researching these artists that were peripheral to this murder case, and that was how I sort of came across this story. And that was really what got me writing.
And how hard or easy was it to get that first book published?
I actually went to a speed pitch thing. So,
Okay.
it was, as you know, like speed dating, you go in and you have sort of 5 minutes with each publisher and you get to do your elevator pitch. And all the publishers were interested. So it was just one of those
that's
great
great.
things for me. Yeah.
So it all fell into place from
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sandra wonders if you have a favourite time to write.
I'm a real morning person. So I get up at literally 4:30 in the morning because that's when my brain works best. And I've got dogs, so the dogs go out first thing. And because it's so quiet, that's my clear headspace time. But I kind of reorganize all my thoughts then. And so morning is far and away my best time. And I crack on and I can sort of blaze right through if I'm in the thick of the story. And then the afternoon just is sometimes that's my editing time. Evenings I'm shot to ribbons. So it's always first thing in the morning for me.
And Kelly wonders if you have a character that you enjoyed writing the most.
Oh gosh, that's really hard. I have a couple of in my Alex Clayton Art Mysteries, which is the main thing. I have a couple of sort of more villainous characters in the next one that I've really enjoyed writing. So sort of little. I guess the best way to call him is Tip Rat Dave. So he's sort of like on the periphery of the art world, but very much the bottom rung of the ladder. And he's just sort of one of those real hard Scrabble characters who's always there in his football beanie with his car with the hole in the muffler and all those sort of little ratty things. And he's just such a real kind of peripheral of society Aussie kind of guy. He's a lot of fun to write.
And I've got the same question from a couple of people, both Kelly and Mary. They're wondering what authors inspire you.
Oh gosh, I'm really interested in some of the early Australian authors. So Charlotte Jay is a particular favourite of mine. So she's was an Australian crime writer in the 50s and 60s, and she's a little bit forgotten now, but she actually won the first Edgar Award, the American Crime Writers Award, ahead of sort of Raymond Chandler and things like that. Australia, I love Peter Temple, sort of more contemporary. He's the way he wrote, just beautiful turns of phrase. There's a lot of good female writers. So Candice Fox is really, really interesting, and I'm dipping in and out of all sorts of different authors at the moment, but those have sort of probably been my go-tos. And I think some of that golden age of crime. So I do tend to go back and look at sort of, Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and those American sort of 1940s, 50s writers.
And I'm wondering if there's anything you might have been reading lately that you'd like to recommend to us.
Oh, I've just finished T.J. Newman's Falling, which is sort of an airline hijack kind of book, which is very sort of white knuckle ride. I'm into Robert Gott's The Orchard Murders, so he's an Australian author, and I'm also reading a biography of the artist Jessie Trail, who was an early 20th century Australian artist. So I've sort of got things going on all over the place there. But I definitely recommend Falling. That's a great one.
Yeah, well, thanks for those recommendations. I'm wondering if there's someone who's really encouraged your writing.
Gosh, that's really hard. It's really funny. My dad years ago, he used to say, why don't you write something, just like this real throwaway line that you sort of think, it doesn't quite work like that, Dad. You can't just write something and it goes. So I'd have to say though, Dad's always been a big champion. He's not here anymore, unfortunately, but he's always been in my corner. And I think I think of that now that all the times when I just roll my eyes at him when he'd say, why don't you just write something? And so here we are now. Angela Meyer has been brilliant. So she was with Echo Publishing when I first published the Portrait of Molly Dean, and she's been amazingly supportive. And then Tony Jordan and Paddy O'Reilly, so two Melbourne-based writers who I did a writing a novel course with, and they've just been brilliant all the way through. So. Yeah, and I think the writing community in general is very supportive in Australia. So a lot of great writers. And Sisters in Crime, of course, are just a brilliant organisation and give so much support to Australian women crime writers.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Suze wonders, when you need a writing break, what activity do you like to do?
I usually teach the dogs a trick. So that's So I think of something crazy to teach them, and then because it's just, that means I get to go outside, I get to move around a bit, and so they learn things like riding a skateboard.
Oh, really?
Really nutty things, and they're big dogs, so it's not, the crazier we can make it, the happier they are, and the more distracting it is for me. So.
And do you video that and put it on Instagram or anything?
There's a couple of little videos floating around of the dogs doing things, yeah. And my other project with the dogs at the moment is they have buttons that have words recorded. So I'm teaching them different words, which is kind of doing my head in, because when I'm in the middle of working, they have a play button, and the young one will be hitting the play button. Say, play. Not now. So I made a bit of a rod from the back with that one, but it's always entertaining seeing how the dogs start to think for themselves too.
Yeah, wow, that sounds really interesting. You'll be able to write a book about that. What sort of dogs are they?
I have a Scottish Deerhound and a Russian Wolfhound, so both very tall,
they must be
tall, lean dogs.
Yeah, very big dogs. And could you tell us what you hope readers will love about your books?
Wow, well, gosh. So I think with the Ms. Fisher, I think it's the world. It's it's that bright, optimistic 1960s world, and the characters, because Peregrine she's a can-do kind of girl. So I think her optimism and her enthusiasm for life in general is what I hope readers like from that one. Schoolgirl Stranglers, it's a bit hard to say about that. Yeah. So I think it's about knowing the victims and understand, knowing their story. I sort of think of that in terms of like a Ned Kelly analogy, in that pretty much everyone in Australia knows who Ned Kelly is. But if you say, can you name the 3 police officers that he murdered at Stringybark Creek, basically no one can tell you who they are. So I want people to come away from the Schoolgirl Strangler remembering the names of the victims as much, if not more so, than they remember the name of the killer. And I guess for the Alex Clayton art mysteries, it's kind of to enjoy that world. So maybe, I don't want to say learn a bit about art, but just to be in that world with Alex, because she's definitely not like Peregrine. She's much crustier and much more wry sort of approach to life. But again, it's being in that world. So that's sort of the Melbourne art world, I guess, is being in that world and enjoying where those people are.
Yeah. And like especially when you're writing the Schoolgirl Strangler and some of the true crime books you write, there obviously must be some really emotionally draining parts to those books. How do you get in the mood to be able to write them?
I think you have to sort of steel yourself a little bit, and certainly I had days in the Public Records Office where I'd hand my files and things back to the librarians there and just say, just put it on the shelf. I'm going home today. I need a break, because there's there was some grueling stuff in there, and the youngest victim in that case was 6 years old. So you have to, I guess, having that end goal in mind of bringing these girls' stories to the public is what sort of keeps you going through that, and honouring them. But you have to, sometimes you just have to go and do something completely different and clear your head. And it was nice to come off the back of that and into the Ms. Fisher thing and have that completely different, frivolous, fictional world.
And could you share with us anything about what you're writing at the moment?
I'm editing Student Final Edits of a standalone. What can I tell you about that? Set in Sydney. It's a little bit more thrillerish, and it's still very quiet, but a little bit more of a thriller vein. And that's going to be out, I think, in January 2023 is the projection at this stage. So can't reveal too much at the moment.
Yeah. So if you're editing that now, does that mean you've started writing something new?
In my head I have.
Yeah, you're thinking about something new.
But not actually on paper, because it does kind of work that way, doesn't it? When you get to that sort of the end point, it's still got a few more edits and things to go, obviously, in the formal process. But in my head I've I've got my little waiting room of characters, and they've been anxiously sort of just about tapping their virtual watches and saying, "Well, come on now, my turn."
Yeah. And could you tell us, when writing a series, how do you keep things fresh for both your readers and for yourself?
I think there's always like a little threads, going through. So I don't like to have it so that you have to go and read them in order. That I think that gets very frustrating for people if they say they have to go back and start with book one. But there are little bits and pieces, and so relationships develop. Perhaps a character that comes in book two is going to be more prominent in book three. The art world's great for writing that. So that's Alex Clayton, because there's in real life there's so many grubby little criminal corners of the art world. That you can just about open a paper every week and be like, well, there's a story idea. Whether it's a museum heist or someone's doing fakes or whatever it is. There's always something in the art world. So that gives you a lot of scope to play with in terms of keeping things fresh, because you're not always going to be it's art, but it's not the same environment.
Yeah. And Cassie's wondering, how long did it take you to gather the information for the Schoolgirl Strangler? And do you think you'll write another true crime book?
It took me probably about just on a year to get the information together. And that was a lot of emailing and phone calling, which is my brain works in a way. I like to have as much research done before I really dive into the writing, because that lets me know how I can put the information together, and also where the gaps are that I'm going to need to try and plug from other sources. How can I find this stuff? And that actually worked out really well, because everything locked down shortly after I gathered most of my information. But at the same time, while I'm doing that, I'm scanning everything and I'm getting an idea in my head for how I'm going to write the book and how it's going to come together. So once all that research is done, the actual writing process is, it's faster than it would be for, when you're formulating a story for yourself, because I'd already kind of worked out how I was going to put this book together. And in terms of other true crime, in researching the Schoolgirl Strangler, there were a couple of other crimes that I came across in the notes and things there that really rather intrigued me. So once I can, in Melbourne, we're still kind of locked down. So once I can get back into the Public Records Office and do a little bit of digging into those cases and see what primary material is still there, I'm going to have a look and see if I can make a book out of one or both of those.
And do you have to, like all those sorts of records, you have to physically go and read them, research them yourself? They don't have it online or anything like that.
No. There are snippets online if it's something like a birth record or things, but most of these only exist as hard copy. And in fact, even sometimes finding the file you want, the catalogue is not sort of fully digitized, so you have to request a ledger from the 1930s and then go through that ledger, and that will give you like a case or a file number that it was assigned back then, and then you go back and re-request cross-referencing that number with a different number to get a box file that has, hopefully the information you want is there somewhere amongst all these other files. If you're super duper lucky, it'll be in numerical order, but it's never in numerical order. So and then hopefully when you find it, there'll be more than a single piece of paper in there. So it is a bit of a fishing expedition, and you can go down huge rabbit holes, because you can also like look at the police effectively like the station notebooks, so you can just sort of trawl through boxes and boxes of things just to look for mentions of things, and things end up in different files if they're vaguely related to different suspects or different people, so you kind of have to go in all sorts of different directions, which is how I came across those other cases. But at the same time, there are days when you just think, I'm never going to find what I want.
It must be quite interesting and exciting as well, though, doing that.
It really is, and I think that's there's a little part of my brain. I love research, so not knowing what you're going to find sometimes.
Mm.
And then when you actually find, you know, the mother load, where it is that chunky file with all those other things you were looking for that have been stuffed in this one file that they really shouldn't be in, but they're all there. And then odd little things, you know, like there was one file that I requested that, you know, had been tied up, you know, in string and knots in 1931 and hadn't been opened since.
Oh, wow.
And so that, you know, that's kind of like, there's a little bit of a, you know, this kind of feeling there. And then other files where, like, there was one that was a peripheral case, and back in 1928, someone had taken a pathology swab. And so I'd opened this file, and amongst all the paper, there was, you know, a little bit of gauze and a glass slide in an envelope. And, you know, and no one else knew it was there. And so I was like, you know, so all these really interesting little things that just sort of just take you into a different world, really.
Yeah. And Kim wonders what you enjoy most about being an author.
Wow, that's really, I like words, so sometimes it's just when you write a really nice sentence, you know, and it doesn't always happen, and you sometimes, you know, you're ditching 10,000 words, but when you just get that nice rhythm and flow, having characters, having other people like your characters, because sometimes you spend so much time with your characters in your head that you know, then when other people can kind of relate to them too, that's a really nice thing. You think, oh, good, it's not just me. I'm not going completely insane here. So just that ability to create worlds, I guess, and play around with people, fictional people, but people nonetheless.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And what do you find the most difficult part of your writing process?
Well, the first paragraph. The first paragraph is always worse. And it took me ages to get over that, because I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, and I've now reconciled myself to the fact that I know that no matter what I do, the first paragraph is always going to be shocking. But at first I couldn't, like, I'd sit there and I'd just go, no, I have to get the first paragraph right before I can do anything else. And now I'm just like, first paragraph, it's going to be lousy, worry about that later. So I'm much more in the zone of get it done and then get it right now. But yeah, my first paragraph, rotten.
And do you have anything you can any tip you can give to any new writer starting out?
Wow. Everyone always says, you know, just write, and it is true. But I think trust in your voice. So it's a skill like any other. You have to practice and you have to keep going. And it's that first paragraph thing again. You know, it's going to be rough as guts the first time you do it, but you have to trust your guts, and you have to trust your head, and blaze on with it. And you have to have a confidence in what you're doing. So, you know, I think whether you're writing it for your own benefit, or you're writing a family history, or you want to get published, you know, you've just got to think, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to get on paper. And yeah, it's that get it done and then get it right later. So you can come back and the words are there, read it out loud. That's my other thing, is because sometimes when things just don't feel right, you know, it's the cadence and the flow of the words. So read it out loud, and then you'll think, oh, it's that little sneaky bit. So yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for talking to us. It's been really interesting talking to you, and I've been wanting to read The Schoolgirl Strangler for a while, so I'll be making sure I go out and get a copy of that.
Thank you, Jackie. It's been my absolute pleasure. It's been lovely talking to you.
Yeah, and thanks for everyone who joined in. We had some good questions. Just wondering, is there ways that people can keep in touch with you?
Yes, I've got a website, katherinekovacic.com, but you can certainly find me on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. So I'm out there. Although I'm not hugely prolific, because I prefer to write rather than tweet. But yes, you can definitely get in touch with me.
No, that's great. Thanks. And I'll be looking out for some videos of your dogs doing their tricks. Thanks. Bye, everybody.